Hey there, wake up. It's Means Morning News. Just after 11 a.m. on the East Coast, I'm the newsman, Sam Sachs. But if I was a pygmy hippo, I'd be Newsdang. When Israel began its ground invasion into Lebanon last month, it claimed it would only be a limited operation in the south. So too did U.S. officials who supported Israel's incursion. But now, more than a week into the invasion, and it's clear that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has other intentions. In a televised address to the people of Lebanon, Netanyahu laid out his plans for a sweeping war of destruction against their country unless they rise up to root out Hezbollah.
This is a message to the people of Lebanon. Do you remember when your country was called the Pearl of the Middle East? I do. So what happened to Lebanon? A gang of tyrants and terrorists destroyed it. That's what happened. I say to you, the people of Lebanon, free your country from Hezbollah so that this war can end. Free your country from Hezbollah so that your country could prosper again. You have an opportunity to save Lebanon before it falls into the abyss of a long war that will lead to destruction and suffering like we see in Gaza.
No longer even keeping up pretenses that the war in Gaza was some targeted operation against Hamas, now Netanyahu is admitting it's a war of total destruction to cause maximum suffering to the Palestinian people. And he plans to bring the same war to Lebanon. And he issued that threat in English, so there's no way that policymakers in Washington can be confused about his intentions, about what Israel will do with the weapons the United States is supplying. So what is the White House going to do about these belligerent threats from a country it's given $17 billion in military aid to in the last year? Well, if you guessed having more direct conversations, then you are correct, because that's about it. Here's State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller, pressed by reporter Saeed Erekat on why the U.S. doesn't use any leverage it has to force Israel to change course.
We give them a lot of money. We give them a great deal of leverage. We give them, obviously, a great deal of political coverage in the UN and many other places and so on. And to suggest that, this huge and lengthy partnership really does not exact any kind of leverage with the Israelis. Don't you question that?
That's not what I said. The thing that I said is that we are a sovereign country with our interests. They are a sovereign country with their interests.
Right. Okay.
We have very direct conversations with them about what we think the appropriate path forward is. But ultimately, like every sovereign country, they have to make their own decisions. They have to bear the consequences for those decisions. They have to carry the risks of those decisions.
Actually, they don't have to carry the risks because the U.S. has parked several aircraft carriers nearby to help intercept retaliatory missiles against Israel. And the U.S. funds and supplies the Iron Dome, which adds another layer of defensive protection. But let's end the charade here, shall we? Miller and the rest of the State Department and the Biden White House know they have leverage over Israel. They're not confused by this. But they're not going to use it because they ultimately agree with what Israel's doing, even if it's regime change war in Lebanon. That's also true when it comes to Israel ratcheting up tensions with Iran. Netanyahu is still promising to attack Iran, and according to NBC News, White House and defense officials are considering joining in on that attack now. This is from NBC. Quote, U.S. military officials discussed options for joining Israel in its retaliation against Iran. U.S. military officials have also discussed conducting very limited strikes against Iranian targets strikes inside Iran have been discussed, as have strikes on targets outside Iran. The U.S. could target Iranian assets at sea or try to disrupt Iran's military assistance to proxies in the region by hitting Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps sites that support militia groups in Yemen or Syria. An official told NBC that a U.S. strike on Iranian targets could be considered defensive if it eliminates a possible threat to the U.S. or allies. Defensive, huh? Yeah, I'm sure that's exactly how such an attack will be interpreted in Iran, which has been subject to airstrikes and assassinations from the Americans and Israelis for years, but has somehow shown remarkable restraint thus far. So, instead of reining in Israel, we're joining them directly in their war-making on Iran. These are what the brain geniuses in the White House and Pentagon are considering. Like the butchers in the Bush administration, Biden's team believe this is their chance to remake the Middle East. But even the Bush folks got cold feet when it came to directly starting a war with Iran, something the U.S. is not at all guaranteed to win. But during a 60 Minutes interview this week, Vice President Kamala Harris didn't appear to share those same concerns about a confrontation with Iran. Take a look.
Which foreign country do you consider to be our greatest adversary?
I think there's an obvious one in mind, which is Iran. Iran has American blood on their hands, okay? This attack on Israel, 200 ballistic missiles. What we need to do to ensure that Iran never achieves the ability to be a nuclear power, that is one of my highest priorities.
So if you have proof that Iran is building a nuclear weapon, would you take military action?
I'm not going to talk about hypotheticals at this moment.
Yep, we are so fucked. No matter who wins in November, the chances that the U.S. will be paradropping Zoomers with M16s into Iran are way, way too high. Grocery giant Albertsons, along with its subsidiaries Vons and Safeway, agreed to settle charges in California that they overbilled their customers through deceptive practices, including fiddling with the weights and measurements of food. The lawsuit was brought by several county attorneys general in California after a years-long investigation. Albertsons will pay a meager $4 million, likely far less than what the store made off its overcharging schemes, which consisted of deceptive advertising, mislabeled shelf prices, and even faulty scales that overcalculated the weight and thus the cost of food customers bought. In addition to the financial settlement, Albertsons agreed to establish a price accuracy program that will provide customers a whole $5 if they're overcharged for an item. How generous. But it doesn't inspire confidence that a grocery store has to roll out a price accuracy program, especially when that grocery store is vying to be the biggest in the country. Albertsons' bid to purchase its competitor, Kroger, is now under review by a judge in Oregon after the Federal Trade Commission sued to block it. It's one of several challenges still facing the merger, which would further consolidate an already consolidated industry and is opposed by consumer advocacy groups and labor unions. Both Albertsons and Kroger CEO claim that if they join forces, prices would somehow go down for consumers, even though all evidence compiled about this sort of stuff proves otherwise. And the two companies have a history of ripping off their customers, as evidenced by this settlement in California, and during last month's FTC hearing on the merger, when a Kroger executive admitted that the store gouged the hell out of customers during the pandemic by increasing prices even higher than costs in order to maximize profits. The judge overseeing the merger case has promised a swift decision that could come down any day now. In the meantime, Albertsons keeps proving why it absolutely cannot be trusted with that sort of market power. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration is slacking when it comes to protecting warehouse workers from injuries on the job. A new Government Accountability Office report found that OSHA's regulatory reach doesn't cover what is one of the most common risks among e-commerce delivery workers: ergonomic hazards that cause musculoskeletal injuries, people contorting their bodies to lift and move boxes and other objects. According to the GAO report, between 2018 and 2023, warehouse and delivery employers were hit with more than 2,500 OSHA violations, but only 11 of them were related to ergonomic hazards, including one complaint at Amazon, where OSHA found that workers were exposed to a high risk of lower back injuries and other musculoskeletal disorders due to high-frequency lifting, awkward twisting, and bending all over a long period of time. The reason for that low count of ergonomic citations is that OSHA doesn't have a clear guidance on what an ergonomic risk is, nor does it train compliance officers on how to identify them, thus leaving a regulatory hole that can be exploited by companies that want to tap into more surplus value from their workforce. So the only way OSHA can take action right now against ergonomic risks is by citing them under the General Duty Clause of the Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970. The problem with that, according to GAO, is that the General Duty Clause citations require a high level of evidence that can make issuing them a challenge. The report states, quote, "Resolving these challenges is especially important because the technologies that employers rely on to enhance productivity may also unintentionally increase the risk of ergonomic hazards." Not sure how unintentional it is. Seems pretty intentional to me. GAO made a number of recommendations to OSHA, including adding a column for musculoskeletal injuries to the record-keeping forms that compliance officers use during inspections. Worth noting that this GAO report dropped the same week as Amazon Prime Days, which a Senate report from Bernie Sanders uncovered was one of the riskiest days of the year for warehouse workers. During Prime Day 2019, nearly half of Amazon's warehouse workforce picked up some kind of injury. Hurricane Helene exposed a failure of the market to supply a critical healthcare need. The storm knocked out a Baxter plant in Marion, North Carolina that manufactures 60% of the nation's IV solution bags. In response, Baxter and other producers are restricting supplies, guaranteeing a shortage for hospitals around the country. This week, the American Hospital Association wrote a letter to President Biden urging him to declare a shortage and invoke the Defense Production Act to force suppliers to manufacture more IV solution. The letter also called on the administration to remove barriers to importation of IV solution bags from abroad and for the Department of Justice to monitor for price gouging in the market. This problem is likely to get worse as another Baxter IV solution facility in Central Florida is now in the direct path of Hurricane Milton, which continues to churn toward the Tampa area on the Florida Gulf Coast. The storm is threatening to be one of the biggest to ever hit the area, and the millions in its path who've been told to evacuate are struggling to flee. There are reports of mass traffic jams and fuel supplies running low. There are also stories of price gouging by airlines and hotels hoping to maximize profits during the crisis. When it comes to these mass evacuations, people are left on their own to get out. There is very little state assistance. That means those who have physical limitations, who don't have transportation to leave, or for any other reason can't evacuate, are often left behind. There are also no current labor protections for workers who opt to evacuate instead of showing up on the job. They can be fired for it with no recourse. And already there are reports of businesses in the area telling their workers they need to be there. During Hurricane Helene, a number of workers were killed in floodwaters after their boss refused to let them leave. Those companies are now under investigation. Okay, friends, the show ends this morning with a sunrise from Oregon. It was sent in by Oscar from a safe rest village of tiny homes for the unhoused in Portland. Enjoy. Thank you, Oscar. That's the show. Thanks for watching, and thanks to the team behind the scenes. Please sign up for Means TV, subscribe to our YouTube and podcast channels, and follow us on social media. One day, capitalism will fall. Until then, we're going to be right here. See you tomorrow.